For the last 2 years, there's been lots that's happened, and it's been nice talking to you. Of course, this evolution of a mediator has got delayed quite a bit. We've had our discussions earlier, and there's been a gap. I think, I don't know how many, but maybe a 9-month gap or something since the last
I don't
time.
think it's been 9 months, but it's been at least 6 months, I think.
So but the good part is that's one story you can't forget.
Well, not, some of it I'd like to forget, but thank you and congratulations on the 2-year anniversary. I think it's quite an achievement, and it's been a pleasure to play a small part in it.
Oh, it's been really nice. It's something that I'm telling you, if I look back, it's like 2 years just gone, back-to-back events, so many conversations. It's been a wonderful journey.
How many videos do you have up now?
Now it's 485.
Oh my goodness.
That's 485 conversations, Bernie. And minimum 1 hour. There's 2 hour and 3 hour and 4 hour conversations also on that. So it's quite a lot of hours of edutainment, as I call it.
Well, Netflix should step aside.
I keep saying that at the bottom of all my posts. Who needs Netflix?
Right. Who needs Netflix or Amazon Prime?
Exactly. But only this on the genocide aspect. So we expand it. We call it war, genocide, and the role of mediators, something like that.
Well, I think if we really want to think about what we have to say or about genocide, it is really most about how we can help in a healing process afterwards, or how we can build it in structures of peacemaking well before things have gotten to that point. But I don't believe there's much we can do to prevent genocide. I think it's so built into the structure of history. And I come to that from somebody who's a child of Holocaust survivors. So, but yeah.
What we will do is we'll just kind of just put it out for a discussion, and let's just call people. Let's just have a conversation on it, because it's something that I've been.
Well, let's have a conversation. But I think it's certainly an important conversation.
But that's on. But 27th of January, is that a possibility?
Probably not, but because I'll be almost ready to go away for a month to. That's next week.
Yeah, that's. Next week actually. No, I'm not sure. We'll do it later. Not a problem.
Because I think I am doing a whole big webinar that morning for a provincial government here in Canada. So
okay. Well, I was trying.
Then we're going off, and then we're going off for the next day or two, a couple of days after that to Australia for a month.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So perfect. We can do it later, because basically I was trying to tie it up with this International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust, but we can do it later. We'll tie it up with something else. So Bernie, journey continues. I think, look, I'll tell you where we were. We finished high school. We've gone through those interesting experiences of yours in working in that factory or whatever, the facility. And you've read lots of interesting books. And of course, the kind of, the foundation of your further journey in terms of social change and all those things. Maybe that's the foundation. So here onwards, Bernie is ready for the world. What's the thought process at that point of time? That's something.
So this was between high school and college where we left off, kind of. Yeah. Where I worked at the Woodhill Chemical Company in their factory making glue. And then I worked at a summer camp. Oh, goodness, what was the thought process? Well, I was a young guy who was very interested in changing the world. I think I must have talked about how at the same time I was doing that, I was very active in the civil rights movement. I had gotten arrested in a demonstration about unequal and segregated schools, and a associate of mine, a minister, was killed in that demonstration. So that was what was going on in my mind, is, all right, what's next? And what I remember that summer, when I was, as I say, working at a summer camp, was reading a headline in the paper about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was basically a manufactured incident by the American government that was used as a means of escalating the conflict with Vietnam, justifying more military intervention. And it would be another 6 months or so before I think the bombing, if I got my timing right here, the bombing of North Vietnam started. And I remember reading that and thinking, this is bad. I remember reading it and I was saying, oh my God, this is very bad. This is not going to lead to good stuff. And saying that to some contemporaries of mine, and they said, oh, stop being such a worrywart. Stop being, you're being histrionic or hysterical or whatever they said, and I said, but I definitely remember feeling at that point, at least with a lot of the people I grew up with, not with all, but with a lot, a beginning of a bit of a disconnect about some of that stuff, which I'm not trying to say, I was certainly not the only one who looked at that and said that this is a really bad thing, what's going on here. But what really struck me was how it began to be, I began to see maybe a parting of the ways with some people who really just wanted to stay in their very privileged place, and me feeling scared, really, I guess, about what this was going to mean. And obviously it meant a lot.
But in general, I mean, in terms of the general attitude, was there just indifference, or what was the general attitude towards it? Is just happening somewhere else and it doesn't concern us? How
At
does
least
that work?
in the community I grew up, the middle class suburban community I grew up in, it was the indifference. Oh, that's someplace else, that's not our problem. You don't need to, those are them, this is we. And obviously that changed. There would be a whole movement developed, things just escalated it. But I think there was still a very large part of the US population supported the war. They supported it to the end.
But how does that happen? I mean, how do people get people to in some way support such things? I mean, what was the role of the media at that point of time, and what was the general communication channels for getting information to them? What was, I mean, look, these are different times. Today
these are very different times. Well, obviously, as the war developed, it grew more and more unpopular. And one of the reasons for that was that people began knowing people who had to go off to war, who were drafted, who came back hurt or killed, didn't come back. But that was a very class divide on that too. I knew a number of people went off to war, but if you look at the statistics afterwards, it was still the people who fought that war were disproportionately people of color, were disproportionately people from a more working class background. And if you were, which I didn't know that at the time, what was going to happen, but if you were a middle class white kid, you probably could avoid it if you wanted to. But there was a draft in the United States. We have an all-volunteer army now, although we could talk about what the word volunteer really means, but nonetheless, we do. And so, we all thought we might get drafted. And then what will we do? So I think when you ask about the media was initially very jingoistic and supportive. They, it was a continuation of the Cold War mentality, those awful commies. There was the whole idea of a domino effect, that if we let the Chinese, Russia supported communist group party, the National Liberation Front, or the different the Vietnamese Communist Party, win, then we would see the Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, etc., go in that direction, and possibly India too, and Pakistan. So so that was, I think, I mean, there were always voices against it, but that was a predominant media story and narrative, and it was promoted by the government. And so I think that people, many people bought into it. I mean, not people who had been in the peace movement like I had been, or who came from a different kind of view of the Cold War. Let's just say it that way. But that, that was what a lot of people thought, and they thought all the people who were demonstrating against the war, and it was initially very small numbers, were just a bunch of kids who were rebelling and having a good time, and were irresponsible and living off their parents' largesse, and were whatever you want to fill in the gap. I remember this one point we organized at Oberlin when the bombing was first started against Hanoi. And that was the real beginning of the escalation of the war, and really putting in many more U.S. troops in South Vietnam. There already were some that had been put in under Kennedy and early years of Johnson, and even some, I think, from the Eisenhower years. But that really led to the escalation fairly quickly in 95 and 96. We organized a little 50-person picket line walking around in circles. And I think I was tasked with trying to get the press to cover it. So I called all sorts of people at the Cleveland Press, which was the city nearby where I grew up. And they came out to cover us. And a couple television stations did. And then we looked at it that evening at the coverage, and the big family was a very short item, but it's the first time anything like that at this school had been covered on TV, I think. Maybe not, but it's the first time I remember. And the cameras they kept on showing pictures of our feet, because some people were wearing boots of some kind or another. We would call hiking boots, I guess, now, but just boots. And that was considered to show how abnormal we were.
Oh my God.
How we were really countercultural. We were really not responsible 50s type upright people. And I remember thinking, wow. And that was the beginning of realizing, it wasn't, because the civil rights movement demonstrations I'd been part of before I went to college, the coverage there was really nasty too. Remember, the Cleveland Press just talked about how totally irresponsible we were, and didn't really look at the issue, didn't have a serious look at the underlying issues itself of unequal access to a good education. So, and housing and jobs and other stuff as well. At any rate, so I don't know if I answered your question, but it did stir that memory up.
I'm just thinking, at that age, you're facing all this, and you're thinking about all that, but then you don't have maybe the social media that we have today to get people together. You don't have those options. So is there a feeling of kind of helplessness there?
I don't know. I always felt helpless. I felt angry. I didn't feel like we couldn't do anything. I think at that point, I thought we could make a difference. We could have some demonstrations and protests, and because there was some successes we were having in the civil rights movement too. So I didn't, I felt that time there was the idea you could change. That was a period of time where the social movements, and it continued. I mean, because it was sort of pre-second wave feminism, but that came eventually, and there was a beginning of the environmental movement and student movement, and we did change things. I mean, things changed, and we were part of that change. And so I don't think I felt helpless. I felt like it was a bit of a slog, and I didn't know what was going to happen. Nobody did. Maybe we would just, it's like looking at Ukraine now. What's going to happen? Ukraine is showing remarkable toughness in the face of what's happening, as did the Vietnamese. But it still seems hard to imagine at that time that the U.S. wouldn't be able to ultimately bomb them into submission. The U.S., that's what the U.S. thought, as what Putin thinks now, I think. And so I didn't know, that seemed like a possibility, but it didn't seem like there was, I also think there was a lot more optimism that we can change the world then. I mean, I think if I look over the long arc, one of the things that's hard of my political life, or my life in trying to work on issues in the world, one of the things that's really hardest to maintain is a belief that things can get better, that things can change, that we really can deal with the most important issues in our time, in our world, and that what will we leave our children and grandchildren? I have said, I think maybe you and I have talked about it, that I feel like maintaining a somewhat of a optimistic spirit is almost a moral obligation, but it has to be realistic. And it is that kind of challenge that I think is harder and harder. At the time, I think we were young, we had our lives ahead of us. We believed we could change the world. And in some ways we did. We were part of the world changing in a good way.
Yeah,
but there were limits too.
No, I'm just thinking that the kind of situations that you have seen, I mean, just the fact that the civil rights movement had to happen, and it did. I mean, I can't say today. Of course, things have changed, but how much have they changed? And still, obviously, there'll be people looking at that not enough, and lots more to happen. But you've seen a lot of change as such. I mean, just the rights of women and civil rights, and of course, like you said, Vietnam.
And people who are, the whole change in attitudes toward LGBTQ people, and the idea that that people of the same sex could get married. That would have been. I hardly knew anybody who was out gay at that time. In fact, I don't think I knew anybody who said they were until a couple of years later. In retrospect, there were a lot of people who obviously were.
But now you're getting into college. I mean, you've got into
college. Oh, yes,
now.
I'm getting to college. Oberlin College in Ohio. Oberlin is a small, fairly high caliber civil rights college. I tell you why I said that. A co-ed college, liberal arts college, that likes to advertise itself correctly as the first co-ed college in the world, but certainly in North America. And that was in 1933 that they first admitted women, 1833. And in 1835, they became the first to admit African Americans.
So let's go there. Let's go there. Let's have a look at it. What does it look like?
That's what this second one on the right, Finney Chapel. No, Peters. That's Peters Hall. That was, I don't know what it is now, but it was some classrooms and some administration. And there were a number of sit-ins we held in that building over the time I was there. And Finney, this one here, the left one in the second row is, I believe that's that's something else. I take it back. Never mind.
Anyway, nice place to be.
It was a lovely pastoral campus. A nice student body, very white in those years. There were more of the Black, especially when I started, more of the Black students who attended Oberlin were from Africa than from the United States. It was it'd like to view itself as the oh wait, what
nice.
Let's stop for a second. You see that little
sorry, I think stop for a second. I think it's stop. Yeah.
So it had a background as a very Christian-oriented school, but it was never with a church. It was never church affiliated, but it was started by Oberlin was named after an Alsatian pastor of some kind or another, John Frederick Oberlin. That archway with the columns, it's in a half circle. It's on the left side there, in the middle there, that one, yeah. That was a memorial to missionaries who were killed in the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1903 or whenever that was. And we used to always say, what about to the Chinese who were killed in the Boxer Rebellion? And that became but that was also where a lot of rallies were held with the right there. But that also symbolized in some ways a somewhat narrow orientation in those years of what was a very liberal college and was seen as a very outlier in Ohio. But it just showed the racism it was also built in there. So it provided, there was no shortage of problems there to be dealt with. There, you see where it says Gibson's Bakery there in the middle one there?
The Gibson's Bakery, yes, one. Yep.
Yep. So that's still there.
Well,
that was there when I was there. That's been in the family for, I don't know, earlier, much earlier than when we went there. About several years ago, a African-American kid was accused of shoplifting by the owners. And that's the son of that owner's, now I think he is the owner, came running out and confronted him. And then there are students who accused him of racial profiling. And there were all these student protests, and they were observed by the administration of the university. It was like, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. And the dean of students, I think, had a copy of some of the leaflets, and someone came up and asked what had happened there. And so she showed him the leaflet, and they accused the university of the college of participating in harassment of the family. And then there was they ended their some contracts to get stuff from them. And so but it turns out that the students actually were shoplifting and admitted to it in some sort of plea deal. And they sued the university, Oberlin College, for millions of dollars and won an appeal, and the college is now paying it. And the college refused settlement offers. They refused, I think, to settle in mediation. And I don't know the inside of it, but I know that it created a great reaction about how bad the college had been in dealing with it. There you go, $36.5 million. But you know what? I don't know this for sure, but I bet you there was racial profiling. I bet you it's much more likely they had their eyes much more carefully on African-American students walking through there than white students. And they just happened to be right this time. But it continues to roil the college. Now, this is something that happened like more than 50 years after I graduated. So, but it shows, the issues that the community still struggles with. I mean, it's got a woman, its president now is an African-American woman. It's much more diverse. It is a very diverse school now. I've had nephew and great nephews who've gone there. I visited them there a number of times. So it really has changed in some ways, but now it is looked as a real kind of leftist outlier. And also it's had terrible labor policies from the time I was there until now. It laid off like 150 unionized workers in the middle of COVID, from jobs like food services and custodial, so they could bust the union by private contracting. And so there's been this contradiction between the view of an image of a very liberal progressive school, and some policies have been really regressive. So if I go back to when I started and when the Vietnam War started, there were some faculty there who had been on the more progressive or liberal side of issues when it came to McCarthyism in the U.S. or to some issues in the civil rights movement. They were more likely to be Democratic. But the political science department there were big supporters of the war in Vietnam. And they all argued it from a Cold War political point of view. I remember being furious how little support we got when a lot of the stuff happened, a lot of the things that happened, which I'll talk about in a second if you'd like, but from the faculty in general. I mean, the students were by and large coming around anyhow over my 4 years there. By the end of it, they were vastly against the support of the war, and I can tell you a couple more stories about that too. But there were only one or two faculty, and they were very junior. And when we asked them to stop having military recruitment going on, military recruiters would come and sign people up to go into the armed forces. We said, no, you're signing them up to go fight a illegitimate war. And they said, no, this is just free speech. And we said, no, free speech is giving a speech in support of the war. You're signing people up to go fight. That's a different issue. And that became that led to a series of sit-ins. And I can tell you more about that, but that was very much part of my experience at Oberlin. And we had almost no faculty support at all on that. So it shows, I think, the contradiction between growing up with a belief in a white liberal or a liberal mindset and what it means when push comes to shove about really confronting a demand for genuine change. And that was true on issues of race and admissions policies. And another issue that really started our activism was that there were very different standards for men and women. So, for example, if you were in a male dorm, and they were separated, we ate together, but the dorm where we slept was in separate dorms. You had, when I first started, you had maid service, and in the female dorms that you did not. And women had to be in by 10 o'clock or something like that at night, and men had no limits on when they had to be into their dorms. And we had a number of, this is something that I've often thought back about. We had demonstrations then about that and actions about it and asked to change. And we did change the social rules eventually, slowly, but we eventually did. But it was all on the fact that we had a lot of arguments that it was ridiculous that you could trust us to make good decisions, and that, none of it was on, that I can remember, this is sexist. If you want to have people come in because you're afraid of the vulnerability of people otherwise, why is it just women who have to do that? And anyhow. I begin to ramble on all these different issues.
No, you must go on, and you were going to tell us some more stories also. You said that there are other things that you're going to tell us. So, please.
Well, let me also say that I think in many ways I did get a good education there. I wasn't the greatest student in the world in those years. I was too much involved in other stuff, but I did. I had some very good teachers, and I felt it was a rounded education. And I developed some very close friendships, many of which are still good friends of mine. So it was also, by the way, a time in which I began to learn how to try to relate in a different kind of way to women. It required breaking down all sorts of stereotypes and stuff I was brought up with. So even though there were all these slow to change forces, there was a world changing, and I remember, and the culture was changing too. I very much remember when each new Beatles album came out, it was like a revelation, or each new Bob Dylan album or Jimi Hendrix or something. Well, one of the things that I got involved in from continued involvement from was participating in the civil rights movement while I was there. I had been arrested in this demonstration in Cleveland, and I was having to run back to Cleveland to go on trial still. It ended sometime during my first year there. That gave me great credibility. The fact that I had to run in to go on trial back to Cleveland, which is about an hour and a half away, so I could stand trial in a civil rights demonstration at Oberlin. That was, that was unusual in a good way. I have to say. But then we also did a number of things in connection with other civil rights activities. So I can't remember exactly the timing of all this. It might have been my second year there, but after the Selma, Alabama march on the Pettus Bridge that John Lewis and Martin Luther King and others were so involved with, we were asked to organize a demonstration at the Hammer Mill Paper Company in Erie, Pennsylvania, which was like a 4-hour drive or 5-hour drive away, because they had announced, the head of Hammer Mill, a big conglomerate, had gotten right at the time of all these demonstrations in Selma, had got on television with George Wallace, who was a governor of Alabama and a terrible segregationist, ran on a segregationist party for president. They got on television with him to say they were announcing the opening of a $25 million, which at the time was enormous, plant in Selma, and they were doing it because of the nature of the people and government of Alabama. And this was the time all this other stuff was happening. So they were scheduling their annual board meeting in Erie, Pennsylvania, at their headquarters plant, and we were asked to go there and have a sit-in there. So we organized with the people from a couple other universities, Western Reserve University and Kent State, and I can't remember where else, a demonstration there. And we went there, and it's a long story, but we all got arrested. We didn't stop any board meeting. They had just moved it and they closed down their offices, but inadvertently, without quite understanding, we didn't really have a great organization of it. We ended up seeing these railroad tracks, and we sat down on them, and they were the railroad tracks that carried all their supplies from their lumberyard, I guess, to the main plant. So inadvertently, we stopped down their whole operation for a day. So they were just going to wait us out. So they finally arrested us, and that was sort of a more notable demonstration. And there was an organization called Oberlin Action for Civil Rights that I got very involved in. But as I may have mentioned, Oberlin wasn't very integrated. So it was mainly white, not entirely, but mainly. And the leadership was white. Something that's it's very hard to imagine in this day. The other thing we did at some point was we went to Mississippi over a break between our semesters to do voter registration. And about this time of year in 1965, I think it was, or maybe it was 66, this time of year in 1966. And we very naive white kids from the North, but we went around but we were organized by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and SNCC and other local organizers. And the group I was with was assigned to this town called Kosciuszko, Mississippi, which is where I'm not going to go into all of that now. It was a small town that was still very, very segregated. The Klan had a big role there. And we did things like we ate together in restaurants meaning integrated group, a black and white group of us would do that. We did some house to house trying to get people to register to vote. And we worked a lot with the local community. But the guy who organized it, a guy named Gunter Frentz, was a bit of a character, a white guy from the North who was living in Mississippi for a couple of years and ran the little Freedom House in Kosciuszko, and was a very close friend of one of the three people who were killed in Mississippi then in a famous incident, civil rights workers, Andrew Goodwin, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. And he was a very good friend of Michael Schwerner. And he thought we needed to escalate the whole situation and defend ourselves more. So he armed us with rifles and shotguns. And my total experience with guns had been some target shooting at a camp before then. And at one point, he used to test whether my parents reluctantly had lent me one of their cars to drive down there. They had two cars, an old Chevy. And he would point at the bottom right corner of the Freedom House, which is really just a shack, and would pull the trigger to see if it was loaded. And once it was loaded, and a shotgun shell went shooting out of the house and through, unfortunately, there was nobody right outside, and through the back window of my parents' car and one of the side windows. So it was shattered. But he made it clear when we were walking around being followed by other cars, by probably Klan cars, trying to intimidate us, that we had guns. And it was amazing how afraid they were of us. Anyhow. But one night there was a fire in a nearby little house, shack, whatever the right word is. We went out to see it. And obviously this was the beginning of an effort to see how many of us were around and who was in there. We went back there in the middle of that night, and we had people rotating through being awake. I was asleep. Some night riders came by, some Klansmen came by and shot into the house with some rifles and some shotguns. And a couple of colleagues and friends, still friends, were wounded. Very lightly wounded, but they were wounded enough that they had to be taken off to a hospital to check them out. And I woke up when that happened, and I grabbed for my rifle and I went running to the front door. By the time I got there, they were gone. But a couple of shots, people jumped in a car and chased them. A couple of shots had been fired off in return. Now, this was a very unusual thing. And it made big national news. And I ended up being interviewed at one point. When I got back at Oberlin, we did a panel, and I ended up being the person who had to justify our use of guns. And so somewhere on a national TV show, the Today Show, the local television station came and took a film and took pictures, a film of it, videoed it, and it then was picked up by the Today Show, my 3 or 4 minute defense of use of guns, which I look back and saying, the hell was I doing? We were coming down just for a couple of weeks. We were going to go back up. who knows what retribution the community would face because of this, although they supported us. I mean, particularly the young people there. They were the ones who armed us, the Black community in Kosciuszko. And also, I mean, this was still a time where the civil rights movement was very clearly committed to a nonviolent stance. And this was one of the incidents that led to some rethinking of that. And, you know, to this day, I believe nonviolence is the best approach at social movements. But I believe, at least within a democratic framework, or even a non-democratic framework. I think there's a lot of reasons, and we could talk about that. But here I was advocating the use of guns to defend our homes. I think my argument was that it's not like we were trying to fight our way into power using guns. We were just defending the homes we were staying in. And, you know, I think that's what a lot of people believed, and maybe correctly. But it's interesting that I think about my role as I think I was 18 years old then, or 19 maybe. Well, no, I was 19. I was almost 20, and here I was trying to be a real militant and arguing about that. But that was probably one of the key coming of age things that, for me, is politically, of having to really think through, well, what did I really believe about this? Because it was easy to get all caught up in the drama of it, you know.
But I'm just thinking, for a 19-year-old to be doing all this, I mean, I don't think any 19-year-old today can imagine all that happening. And I'm sure, I mean, at least in the US, I'm sure other parts of the world, I'm sure there's lots happening with people. But to just think that all that was happening, and I was just going to ask you, what were the games you were playing in college? And I find out you're playing with guns.
Yeah. Well, I played, you know, we had a touch football and soccer and volleyball. I did a lot of sports stuff, not well, but I played it. And lacrosse, I remember. It was a time to try out a lot of different things. And there were games too, music and dancing, and trying to figure out what it meant to be a coming of age guy who was basically shy around women, you know.
So then now you're out there, you're meeting so many people, women, other people, I mean, everyone. Mm-hmm. So what are the relationships developing at that point of time? Because now you're exposed to, of course, totally different set of people.
Well, I think it took a while before I had anything even close to a meaningful romantic relationship. But I had a lot of close friendships, both women and men. And one of the things that, after my first year, that made an enormous difference in my experience there was that there was a cooperative movement at Oberlin, where a number of mostly small dormitories where women lived in those years and men came to eat, because that's how they did it, were run by students, where they did the cooking, housekeeping, you know, the maintenance, the buying the food, creating the menus. And when I started, there were 2 cooperative dormitories, and one of them was called Tank, and I was in that one. And they had, I think, a total of 90 people, if I remember correctly, half of whom lived there and the other half came and ate there. And there I was for 3 years. I was a part of the cooperative. You had to get in by lottery, and somehow I got in. I did well on lotteries in those days. I got in all 3 years, and that was a very important focal point. A lot of the most politically active people were there, so that was a place of I don't know. I guess some companionship that way, but it's, you know, where relationships happened and music happened and dances happened and volleyball happened. We had the most brutally illegal games of volleyball all the time outside. And
has Woodstock
it
happened
still
or not?
exists.
What? Has Woodstock happened or not?
No, Woodstock was after I graduated. It was 1969. I graduated in 68. Okay. So it was a year after I graduated. And so that was an important part of my experience there. And one of the big struggles was a lot more students wanted to be in co-ops, and the college really damped that down and tried to prevent that. And I remember over a couple of years of efforts, we finally negotiated a third co-op, Keep. And then there were several others in the years afterwards. And that's still a struggle going on. The college is still trying to limit the amount of co-ops and the and charge them a lot more money for the building. And I don't know the details about it, but I do know that this year and last year, when I gave money to the college, you could designate it for different parts of it. I designated all the money I gave, which wasn't an enormous amount, to the co-ops. So there's a certain interesting continuity to some of this stuff. The other thing maybe I'll say about Oberlin before we can, I don't know what else you would want me to say about it, but was I majored in history, in European history, supposedly. But I really studied Russian and Chinese history because I was really interested in revolution. That was my mindset. So I studied the Russian revolutions and the Chinese and the history there. And I studied sociology and some science and math stuff and some, and certainly literature. But that was that was probably my passion, some sociology. I did take a few political science courses and economics courses, but I did not find them very useful at the time. And I thought they were very much about how you maintain a system that I thought should be changed.
But in terms of the content of these courses that you're taking, I mean, was that in any way, influenced by anyone? The government or certain people who fund the college or anyone else? Is it really, if you look back, did you get an overall idea the way you should have? Or in terms of the Chinese or the Russian Revolution, it didn't matter so much?
It's a very good question. I don't think in a very direct or obvious way. Some of my teachers were people who had been part of one kind of grew up in the 50s in the Cold War era or before, were veterans of World War II. And I remember one of them was a guy who I studied a lot about Chinese history with, Ellsworth Carlson. He was a really good guy. He was very conservative, actually. He was very, in his own thinking of Cold War, but he was very tolerant of me going off. I did some private studies with him, some small seminars of me going off and studying what I wanted, and he probably being much more sure of what I believed than I should have, given my level of knowledge. And so he was good about that. And another professor who I actually got quite close to, who later on wrote me a letter of recommendation for applying for a conscientious objector status, which I didn't get, but he wrote it, was a physics professor who I took a year-long physics course, this guy named David Anderson, who had been in the Navy in World War II, but it was also was trained in physics. So he was at Los Alamos while they were developing the atomic bomb. And he was one of the 4 people who was sent to the Pacific, I think to Guam, wherever the plane, the Enola Gay, was launched to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. He was one of 4 people who did the final assembly on the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And he had then come back and he'd become a Anglican minister on the side. But, he never completely rejected what he did, but he was the head of the student life committee when I was president of student government, which I was my last year there. And so I negotiated with him all the time. And we actually became quite close friends and stayed that way for a number of years afterwards. He died many, many years ago. And so, what can I say? They often came from a very much different background, but there was at least in terms of inquiry, there was a belief in, letting us find our way through a lot of that stuff, not propagandized. There were some who were much more so. There was an economics professor who was, and a political science professor who were very popular among students, somewhat charismatic, particularly a political science professor, who were real big Cold Warriors. And when we had sit-ins against recruiters, and we were being threatened with expulsion, and it got very tense and very close. And I was often the person who had to do the negotiating, because as I said, I was president of student government that last year about that. These were people who said, yeah, go ahead and expel them. And the president of the college, a guy named Robert Carr, who really shouldn't have been president of a college at that time for a number of reasons. He had terrible interpersonal skills. He had a terrible temper. And he felt he had a political science background. He felt his whole work on free speech under the McCarthy era, where he had written some good stuff, was being attacked. And I had to deal with him. And I remember at one point when there was a sit-in going in, and I was inside trying to negotiate what was going to happen, where it really looked like it might explode. And I remember him coming out of a back room, absolutely red and livid, and the arm coming from it, grabbing him and pulling him back in. And then I ended up dealing with the dean of students and this faculty member I mentioned, and an assistant to the president. He was coming out to expel us all. And he didn't. And we found our way through that. And we kind of negotiated our way into an agreement by which we would have a big study, a typical Oberlin solution, a big study of it all. And while that study was happening, they would suspend the use of the invitation of military recruiters on campus, and there was a committee set up, and there was a big teach-in. I have a picture of myself talking to it someplace or other.
That's what we need to see. We need to see those pictures. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's anyhow. Let's not. It exists, but I'm not going to. It might even be in this room, but I don't want to spend the time right now looking for it. But and for the rest of the Vietnam War, there was never again a military recruiter there. They kept on studying it to death for the next several years, and that was it. I then graduated and was off to Columbia. So, I think the teachers were probably very influenced, but I don't think they were limited in the same way that they might be now. And it wasn't a public college either. It was a private college with a big endowment.
But I'm just thinking in terms of research material, of course, what is available to people today obviously was not as much available there. So the narrative that is given to the students, they have to kind of accept it to a certain extent. Of course.
Well, yeah, you could write papers on what you wanted, and they had libraries, lots of stuff. But I did belong to a group, a Marxist study group, where we read, just student organized, where we read all sorts of left-wing stuff at that point. It's funny to look back at that right now, but I guess it was a very good way of learning some of it. I had not had any contact with any of those people in that group for at least 50 years. until last spring, when one of the things I do in this town sometimes is I play pickleball. I don't know if you know what pickleball is.
I know. It's interesting.
Yeah. And so I was at a local rec center in this small town nearby, and there was this guy I was playing with, and he looked slightly like the sort of person I might know, one of those vaguely familiar, but and then we got to talking, and turns out we were at Oberlin together, and he was in that group. And he went on, and he stayed very much of a leftist and a Marxist. Maybe he still is, but he became a school teacher in Detroit for many years, and he retired, and he plays pickleball 5 times a week or something like that. He's a much better pickleball player than me. I just occasionally do it, but so.
But you know that there have been mediation opportunities coming up because of pickleball. Have you read any of those?
Yes, I do know that in the relationship between tennis players and pickleball.
And one of my friends and neighbors also. I mean,
and neighbors, exactly right. There are mediation opportunities. I haven't taken any of them up, but in this town, a pickle. Yes, right. I absolutely have seen that. Where is this?
This is in Monterey County.
Oh, in California, Pacific Grove, Monterey. Yeah. Oh, that's really funny.
It is.
It's very funny.
It's the noise. I think the noise with the racket, I think the bat.
You know that they have developed balls that don't make as much noise. Yeah. They also don't bounce the right way, though.
So, it's amazing how popular it's become.
It is. I play it. A friend of mine up the 3 houses up the street has made a pickleball court in his driveway. That's where we play in summer.
Not bad at all. I think.
And the neighbors are fine around here. We don't play it in the middle of the night.
But but tell me, Bernie, how does this whole cooperative thing work? These cooperatives that you had?
Well, they were students formed them in the early 50s. I remember people I knew before me, my sister-in-law for one, were there well before I was. And I think they didn't want to eat. I'm not 100% sure what the initial foundation of it was, but sort of historically, Oberlin's motto was learning and labor. Because when it was first founded, the idea was everybody would work there too, and that would be how the college would work, and that would include growing food and so forth, in the early 19th century. Somehow or other, as years got on, I think into the 20th century, people said, we've lost it. We're just hiring food services or hiring people to do our own cooking. We should do it ourselves, and we should not have to pay the same amount of board. We can pay it to the cooperative, and we can do it cheaper if we do a lot of it ourselves. And so at some point, they reached an agreement with the college to rent 2 of the dormitories. And so instead of our housing costs going straight to the college, it went to this Oberlin Student Cooperative Association, who had to maintain certain standards of maintenance of the building. I think they still did that through the college. I think they paid the college for some maintenance, but otherwise they ran it themselves. And I think we hired somebody to help with the cooking at some point. I think that ended after I left, but I think the college was worried we're all going to poison ourselves or something. And then as years went on, and only beginning when I was there, it got connected much more with vegetarianism and other things like that, but there was a real spirit to it when I was there, and I visited it a number of times since then, because I've been to reunions or because I was visiting relatives there, and I stopped in on the co-ops, and it still felt like it had a very kind of really nicely a different than a regular dormitory. It felt like there was a much different kind of community there.
With your experience with the cooperative and that Juniper Street cooperative that you formed later, because I'm really interested in that, because this whole dispute resolution revolution that I talk about, this whole relationship, how to structure it with people, because definitely the group dynamics and the individual and how to take it forward. So this is something that you'll of course take me through and see how what your experience is there, good, bad, ugly. But there is Peter. Yeah.
But I think it's been very influential on my life. And that I actually, there's a chapter in one of my books, the conflict paradox, about community and autonomy, about how we have to, those are two fundamental human needs. So I think that I grew up in a community, if you may recall, in this residential treatment center that my father was a director of, but it was a community of a very different kind than just a regular suburban community. And then in Oberlin, there was this cooperative situation. And then from Oberlin, I went off to Columbia and lived in New York for 4 years. And then when I moved to Colorado, I first lived on a collective farm for a couple of years. It's where I met my first wife and my stepson, who was just an infant then. And I worked on the farm, and I also, and I remember driving a school bus then. I'd already been a social worker and had a master's degree and whatever. But this was returning to nature. This was doing my hippie thing. And I did that for a couple of years. And then we started the Juniper Street Collective, which ran for 20 years that way, and we, in some ways longer, by some measures 30 years, but very much where we ate together 5 times a week and did gardening and did all our shopping together. That was over 20 years like that. And my work at CDR Associates was within the model there was it was a partnership of 4 of us and 5 and up to 7 of us who ran it by consensus, who ran it in a communal way too, although it had a board and it had a different a business structure too. Those often got in tension with each other. And then I live in the small community, which is, so it's obviously a theme in my life. And why that is, I guess I have to examine myself and have at times in some ways as to what about me really is attracted to that and how has that influenced me. But it's definitely true that I have learned over many years that in order for communities to work, you have to be able to deal with conflict, because a lot of communities like that fall apart. A lot of efforts to have utopian communities or idealistic communities fall apart because they don't recognize that you can have a community, but you still have to allow for individualism. And if you grew up in the United States, you grew up in a very individualist culture, where the rugged individualism or whatever, and it's, but there's still a need for coming together and for coming to, and a lot of times that's a function of religious institutions. They provide a sense of community, whereas then people live in autonomous family situations, and in particularly in, there are some communities where the extended family is critical, and others which are much more atomized, where kids go off and live in their own place and at a distance. In my family, it was my parents and my brother and I were the only part of my family who lived in the city we lived in. The nearest other relatives we had were 500 miles away. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have that kind of family community. The religion was not a major force in providing community to me. So maybe that was a need I had in some other ways, and I think we all have it. We all find our own ways of working together with our needs for being individuals and our needs for community. So Vikram, I don't know if you look at it this way, but you've created a community.
That's exactly that's exactly
international.
Yeah.
And I wonder why you did it. I mean, what was your motivation? It's just an amazing online international community that does incredible stuff.
For me, I think it was just the fact that you could connect with wonderful people, and you can create this little world of your little bubble. I still call it a bubble. It might be a bubble, but to be able to create that and just have good conversations like what we're having, and let's say over time the positive energies that develop through it, and I just feel that maybe some impact over time as we keep doing our work, because that world mediation circle and the circles that I'm now creating. So right at the grassroots level, if we can actually get these good people together, why do we have all the time? I do see people wanting to get everyone together and let's change the world in one go. It's not going to happen. It's going to be small groups changing the situation around them, having those objective conversations, and then people recognizing that this is also an option. You'll hear me say about activism, advocacy, politics on one side, and these people who can create this whole circle of dialogue and conversation and collaboration, be it small. And when some positive things are seen around, people would want to join it, and then let it grow. But that's where this whole concept of when it grows, because look, for me, it's very, very clear. It's easy for me to do in the online world. When I find people, I find supremacists. There are supremacists who do come in. For me, I'm not here. I'm not a spiritual guru to change your view of life. I can actually very easily just keep them aside. So that's the advantage in the online world. Physical world, definitely you were creating it in the physical world. So I'm sure there are different dynamics there. But for me, that's been the advantage. I call it an advantage. It's not...
Well, I understand that. I think the whole like our ability to connect across differences, distances. I mean, well, and across differences, is enhanced tremendously now from what it used to be. And so I think some of my closest friends and colleagues are at great distances. One of the reasons we're going to spend a month in Australia to get out of the Canadian winter, but we'll be doing some work there too, is we have very close friends and colleagues there who we connect with all the time. It's halfway around the world. In some ways, they're, my closest, most important connections are with people who I don't see face to face right now. And in the subtitle of our last book, as well, is disrupting and connecting for change. That you need both. You need both things. And Jackie and I wrote it without ever being in the same room together. It's not unique, but it's pretty startling. And I think the internet has provided a real mechanism for us to have community where otherwise it might be much more difficult. But it's limits too. It's wider but narrower, if you think about it. It's ways in which I mean, you and I have never gone out for coffee or a beer together, and it would be nice to do that, because I like talking with you like this, and but it's not, there isn't the same groupness to it or the same breadth of activities that often define connection as well, like golf.
No, I think for me, that's the difference. For me, it's actually as good as a connection when you're sitting together. Never felt that difference at all. Because like I've been talking about this, that when you connect at a deeper level, and after that, all that doesn't matter whether you're in the physical world or not. You've connected somewhere where, I mean, that physical limitation doesn't come into the picture. So maybe that's why I've enjoyed it. Maybe because there is something to those energies. We've spoken about it in our heart, soul, spirituality, and all that. There are certain energies which you can feel, and you can feel them in the Zoom sessions also. So yes, there is something to that.
No, there is something to that. That's true. I just have to check one thing here real quickly, which is what time it is.
It's my 8.
Oh, I'm doing fine. I have another 15 minutes or so if we need it.
But one question that came up, and Peter Singer has put that in the chat, which I was also going to get to, that how your parents are reacting to your gunfights and you're almost getting expelled. But let me just read it out. Of course, there is Atman, he's in Morocco. He's saying hi. There's Ellis. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing correct. There's a hi there. Peter Singer, one question is, how did you feel getting a gun? Did it sink in that you may be offering your life for a cause, and did it modify your thinking in any way? Second question is, Bernie, do you recall your father's view of your involvement in civil rights with his own history of racism and political imprisonment in Nazi Germany? Did his story have any sway on your activism? And Michelle is saying interesting. So, yeah.
Well, all right. It's very much affected me. And to this day, in some ways, the thing is, I knew we were putting our lives in danger. And my parents at first, because I was under the age of 21 at that point, I needed them to sign a permission slip for me to go to Mississippi. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party wanted it. I guess they were worried about liability or whatever. And my parents at first refused to do it. And I remember really losing it, and at them. And finally they came around and they lent me their car that got its windows shot out. But that they didn't want me to go because they were worried. On the other hand, I think my father was aware that he had put his own life in danger at many times. And so there was part of him that was always kind of proud of it. And I remember when Oberlin is near Cleveland. I grew up in Cleveland, so I was one of the local boys who was in this incident, or people, there were women too, in this incident where there was shooting. And so the papers focused a bit on me because I was from Cleveland, and Oberlin's near Cleveland. And at some point they interviewed my father as well, who was great. I mean, he really did stand by me in that. But there were all these really nasty letters that he got, or that I got, threatening him, and vile anti-Semitic letters, and threatened to kill me, and saying, I remember one said, your boy should come home in a box. And he wrote a letter to the newspaper about that. And where are the people supporting this? So he was very good on that. On the other hand, he was worried that I was neglecting my studies. And at one point, it was a couple of years afterwards, I had showed some vulnerability of feeling a little, down. And his response was, I want you to leave Oberlin and go someplace else. You're under the influence of all these wrong people. And we could threaten financially, but that's not what we're doing now. And I wrote him back, I think, and said, yes, you are. That's exactly what you're doing. And if you decide to pull your support of me, fine, I'll find some other way of getting it, but that will be the end of our relationship, or something dramatic like that. So there was a lot of, he on the one hand, he was supportive politically, and I think he understood it, and he'd been through a lot himself. On the other hand, he said, do I still have to worry about, stuff like this in my life? And my mother really said, we've been through so much. She lost her parents in the Holocaust. Can't we have peace? But her values were good on this too. But she didn't want me to be doing stuff like that. So there was always a mixed message. I get underneath it all the sense that it was something they were proud of, but didn't want me to neglect my studies, which I did somewhat. And to this day, I feel like, I think it was understandable, the use of something had to be done, because the government wasn't doing much at that point to protect civil rights workers and the like. And I can understand why people might have armed themselves to protect their own homes. I don't have but I still feel like we were not the right ones to cross that line. On the other hand, the fact that we were white middle-class kids from the North gave a certain amount of protection to us that the local community wouldn't have had. So when we did that, it stopped some of the violent attacks that occurred. And in fact, some of the violent efforts to suppress voter registration, it was kind of effective. So I still try to struggle with all of that at this point. But I continue to believe that in terms of organizing movements for change, nonviolence is the right approach. But what do you do when you're being attacked and you're being and we still, people have a right to defend themselves too, I think. So I wouldn't say I've ever put it all together. It's an ongoing struggle. A simple thing that says under no circumstances is violence ever justified. I do not take that stance. I do not take a Quaker stance on that. On the other hand, in terms of how you achieve effective social change, I think the efforts to engage in disciplined nonviolent actions are often the most effective. Have I asked Peter if I answered his questions?
Peter, has he answered your question? What I'm doing is let me send him the Zoom link also if he wants to drop in and ask you. Why not, Peter Singer? So in terms of, I was just thinking from the book perspective about connecting and disrupting and the fact that you were comparing it to what I was doing. I'm just thinking there also neutrality, I think, is something again, which in a way plays a role, and I'm not neutral when it comes to that. And I think do see how people are, reacting to each other or treating each other. And I have to, the safe space that people say that I've created, I think those kinds of things, I think, are important for me to create a group, which is.
I agree. I would simply say that it's not really neutrality that creates the same safe space, but a commitment to helping people be a space, be safe, and committing to an approach that gives everybody a legitimate voice and one they can exercise in a safe way, and that allows people to connect and relate to each other in a different kind of way. In order to really do that, we sometimes have to take fairly strong stands.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why the book's called The Neutrality Trap. Exactly. Because if you say you're just going to be neutral, you know what I think about this. If you say you're just going to be neutral, then you don't do the stuff that really deals with the power differential that really is what creates space, means that spaces won't be safe.
Absolutely. So that's what I'm kind of relating to that aspect. Yes, definitely. But at this point, say you finish college now, like last time we kind of did a little kind of a.
Now I'm off to New York. I'm off to New York.
That's the next episode. You're not going to New York this time.
I'm being drafted. I'm having to deal with the draft. I'm applying for being a conscientious objector, and I'm being turned down. So that we can leave it at that point.
Yeah, these are the highlights.
And I'm starting social work school because I figure, well, I don't really know what I want to do. I think I might end up being drafted. I can probably put it off for a little while, get my degree, and that'll open up all sorts of possible doors. I like to work with kids. Even through all of my college years, I continue to work as a counselor in a residential treatment center and in a summer camp for kids with difficulty too. So
that's like total trailer for the next episode. but I think what you need to do, of course, this part I think we should take up in the next episode. Now your New York experience, but up till now, whatever you've seen now in relation to did you ever have a conversation with someone from the Klan? Did you understand their perspective?
Oh, I certainly had conversations with people who had been in the Klan. I probably had conversations with people who were in the Klan that I didn't know. And there were colleagues of mine who tried to, I wasn't part of this, try to facilitate conversations between a Klan member and a prominent member of the Jewish community. I wondered about that, but they did do that, and I guess it went okay. But I haven't, I recently found out that somebody I knew personally was a big supporter of the truckers' blockade in in Canada and a big supporter of Trump and a big election denier. And I always look for people. I think it's important to try to talk to people like that. But a couple of people, one guy I was with said, this is in Canada now, I've never met a Trump supporter before in my life or heard it. No, I said, yes, you have. You just don't know it. And it's, they're still people. They're still humans.
But I'm just thinking that of course, everyone has their ideologies. So I'm just thinking, someone from the clan, how do they justify to themselves the kinds of things they think, the things they do? How does that happen? Did you ever try to get into that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a chapter in the book called Beyond Crazy, Stupid, or Evil, understanding the people who we profoundly disagree with. And I talked about how do you understand Trump supporters? But I also, how do you understand Nazis? How do you understand Klans people? How do you understand rapists? And how do you understand Harvey Weinstein? And so the reason I say beyond crazy, stupid, and evil is that those are what I often have called the three explanatory crutches we use. We say that Nazism happened because people were crazy, stupid, or evil. The Klan is people, whatever you want. And it's not like there's not craziness, stupidness, or evil there, but it doesn't explain it. You have to understand to what extent are they acting in a way that they think promotes their own sense of who they are. And I think that's one of the real most significant contributions conflict professionals can offer is to dig deeper, not to pretend it's everybody's okay. It's not all the same. But we can help dig deeper and really try to understand what it is. And I think if we do, we will find the answers. In fact, that there are a lot of ways in which the systems we've created to run our world are not working for a lot of people.
Those are the thoughts that we want to take, Bernie, when creating this whole grassroots movement. These are the thoughts we need there, because that's where, if change, that's the attempt, that let's start from there, and whatever, right. It'll take its time, but these experiences of yours and your thought on how things can change there, I think that we need that. So you will be required to come in and speak about
I'll come back at some point. And I'm appreciate it again. I know that I just felt like when I tell these stories, it stirs up my memories, and I kind of ramble on as the memories come back to me. But it is what these conversations are doing for me. Is making me put all stuff in perspective. So thank you.
So we're not going to give a long gap like this. We are going to take this up after Australia. Is it going to be done after
Australia? In March.
In March. Okay. So
I'll be back in March. I'll be in Australia in February.
Perfect. So we need, of course, there is a symposium coming up on language and mediation in February. So if from Australia, if you want to participate, if you have time, we can always fix up a session there. So that's language and mediation.
I'm trying to clear the decks of my work life in February. I am doing some work there, but aside from that, but send it to me. We'll see.
Yeah. And of course, for Women's Day, your wife we have to fix up that also for Women's Day.
Yes, you do.
Whatever. Yeah. So I think, yeah. So it's been obviously always a pleasure speaking to you, and we're going to continue this conversation. So
thank you very much.
And I sent that message, Zoom link to Peter, but definitely, I don't know whether you saw that. So we can always get him in later if he has any questions.
No, Peter, I know Peter.
Yeah,
he's a good guy.
Yeah, he was on one of the symposium that I had, the World Mediators Conference, I think. So interesting his thoughts on. I think he was talking about the family, the businesses. I think there was something there. I think we were talking about. Yeah. So perfect, Bernie. Thank you very much. And
take care.
See you as soon as you get time.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.